Brooklyn's oldest Latino community-based organization. It was founded in 1964. I did not found Uprose. No one thought that was funny. Yeah, I always say, if you think I founded Uprose, then I have to say the World Tax is working. The organization is an intergenerational, multiracial, multinational community-based organization that's committed to doing environmental justice. I'm the chair of the U.S. EPA National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and so I do a lot of work both locally, citywide, statewide, and nationally on environmental justice. And since I'm the first one to speak, what I'd like to do is frame what environmental justice is in this country, because the sister will talk about what it is internationally, but what it is in this country, people often misunderstand. And since the theme to this conference is interdependence, I want to talk a little bit about that as well. Oftentimes people think that environmental justice is about the disparate siting of environmental burdens in communities of color, and stop right there. Environmental justice isn't just about that. It involves a process and one of the basic tenets of environmental justice is that we speak for ourselves. That, in terms of developing interrelations with folks, building community power and building alliances, is one of the most biggest challenges because people have a really difficult time in checking their privilege at the door. And when you raise that, people get very defensive and don't understand why environmental justice is very different than a traditional civil rights model where folks represented us, litigated for us, helped us mobilize, put together agendas for us, and that environmental justice is completely opposite that. And so that's difficult. So we have these principles that guide us, everything from the environmental justice principles, principles of working together, the Humanities principles for democratic organizing, and these principles that I brought for you today, because of course everybody is talking about green jobs, right? And seem to think that green jobs mean environmental justice, and these are the environmental justice, green economy guiding principles. So I brought those for you because there is a big difference between environmentalism and environmental justice. And so a lot of environmentalists now are looking at the demographics, and they're seeing that by 2042 that we are going to be the majority in the country, and they want to be able not only to set the agenda, but access the resources that determine what our communities are going to look like. So you see that a lot of them hire what are called EJ coordinators, and by doing things like that, really put themselves in competition with grassroots groups that are doing transformational work on the ground, instead of using their work to complement, support, and work in solidarity with grassroots organizations that are doing the work. So that becomes sort of an area of tension that exists locally, that exists citywide, statewide, and nationally. But unfortunately, it really is necessary for those folks who have been doing that work for so long. It's really important that they get out of their comfort zone and start working with communities in a very different way. There are two things that are happening in the world right now that really sort of tell us how developing relationships has to happen. One is that there's less funding, and there's going to be less funding available, right? And two is climate change. And so those two things mean that our partnerships, whether it's with scientists, the scientists sort of have to get out of their ivory towers and take those reports off their shelves and stop thinking of communities as case studies and anecdotes to their reports. They need to make their science accessible. They need to break it down. They need to put, like in our organization, we've got mobile air monitors where we measure PM 2.5, NOx, SOx, carbon monoxide, and our young people do water testing. They do all of that. They are the community scientists. Engineers, GIS mappers, planners, all have to work with community in a very different way. Communities have local knowledge, and that knowledge really has to drive the agenda, and those partnerships make it possible for us to actually, in a very collective way, do work that's transformational. And it's happening. We've done it with Pratt Institute. We did this work on climate adaptation and community resilience, and the professors and the students were very, very professional and very respectful. And they didn't come in with agenda. We said, this is what the community wants, and together, collectively, we put together short-term solutions, medium and long-term solutions. Everything from looking at stormwater capture, bioswales, permeable surfaces, vertical farms. We had all kinds of recommendations that came out of the community process. They walked away better, and we walked away better from a relationship that really respected the principles of environmental justice. And this map that you see here, and you take a really good look at it, because this map shows which communities are most vulnerable to a storm surge in the next 10 years. And those communities are all communities of color in New York City. They're all located in places called significant maritime industrial areas. Significant maritime industrial areas are places that have all of our manufacturing, and we want to retain manufacturing, right? But we don't know what chemicals are used there. There isn't an inventory that tells communities what chemicals are there. We don't know whether they're containerized or whether they're not. And we know that if there's a storm surge in Sunset Park, for example, where our community is located, Sunset Park is a community that's predominantly Latino, of African and indigenous ancestry, Asian, and predominantly Chinese, and Arab, predominantly Palestinian. And so we have this community where the water can come up to as far as 3rd Avenue. And on the waterfront, we've got all of these industries, right? What does that mean for the largest walk-to-work community in New York City, which is what Sunset Park is, and that in itself makes it sustainable, right? And what does that mean if you take out that economic part of the community for the region? And what does it mean for the workers and for the community if all of a sudden a storm surge creates a huge, huge brownfield? So we're trying to be proactive in trying to find out how we can get an inventory of that information. We not just fight against things. You know, I don't know if you know recently, because we're members of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, passed 3 huge pieces of our legislation. Article 10, which determines the siting of power plants. It's the first time in the history of the United States that there is legislation that looks at cumulative impact, health profiles, proximity to environmental burdens. That's really important, because when they're doing permitting, they only look at the emissions of one facility. So we're saying that you have to look at the cumulative effect of all of these toxins. I was just at an NIHS meeting where they told me the difference between toxicants and toxins. So I may be getting it all wrong, but that's all right. You know what I'm talking about. So you have to look at that, because we have densely populated communities that are being exposed to this stuff in utero. And we're seeing manifestations of disease at every level, all the way out to the point where people become elders. So you'll see that it's the South Bronx, it's Williamsburg, it's Sunset Park, it's Red Hook, it's East Harlem. It's all of the communities where our people live. And so we have to not only fight against the siting of things like waste to energy, which is a big thing that's coming our way. And we knew the minute they started talking about it in the mayor's office, we knew that it was going to head to our communities, right? So we're preparing for that now. But we're also proactive, doing urban forestry, planting greenways, and working for waterfront parks. The sad part of that is that every time we get environmental amenities that we don't have, because environmental justice isn't just about disparate impact, it's also about the lack of environmental amenities that exist in our communities, is that the minute that we hook up the community, the minute we green it up, the community gets gentrified and our people get pushed out. So that the message to our community is that in order for you to live here, you have to live next to a waste transfer station, you need to live next to a power plant, or you can't afford to live here. Which discourages people who are thinking about green roofs, urban forestry, and reclaiming the environment, because the environment for us in the movement is not just about the beautification of trees, but the fact that trees are the lungs of our community, and that we need that because it is our children that are suffering from these diseases. We have all, those of us who were born and raised in these communities, work in these communities, all suffer from health problems as a result of it. So those are some of the things about environmental justice. On a national level, we work with each other, share expertise, share information, strategy. We work across professions. In any given meeting, we will have an engineer, we'll have a scientist, and we'll have a lawyer. And all of those professions, regardless of what you're pursuing here at Barnard or wherever you're coming from to this conference, regardless of what you're pursuing, you're going to have to deal with the issue of climate change and its impact on the most vulnerable communities. Not only are you going to have to figure out what your profession or what your career or what your goals are going to mean in this construct, but you also have to think about how you engage communities in a way that's meaningful and respectful, because of that basic tenet that says that we speak for ourselves. I'm a lawyer, and I'm a Puerto Rican lawyer, and so I come from struggle, but I'm still a lawyer. And so when I walk in a room, People in our community say, "Llegó la abogada," and they think that I know everything. And I have to, with a tremendous amount of humility and respect, be quiet and listen with all my senses. And I've learned a lot from being someone who is respectful of the process and from listening. I never took an environmental policy class in my life. We started doing this work because it had to be done. It was about disparate impact, and it was about vulnerable communities being affected. And I learned a lot about how to engage community from community. Our organization is intergenerational, which means that our young people are on our board of directors, they're on our staff. Our organizer started at Up Rose when he was 10 years old, and he's now an organizer. He turned 25 yesterday, which makes me feel really old. Our website, if you look at it, was designed by someone who just graduated from college, who started with us when she was 14. We are really intentional about being inclusive so that when you walk in the door, there's a mezuzah when you walk in. You walk further in and you're gonna see kente cloth. You're gonna see everything that is the flavor of our people. We do leadership training so people at our organization understand struggle and understand that you either believe in justice or you don't, that you can't parse it out. You know, I always talk about the cab drivers, you know, the cab drivers that don't want to be racially profiled but won't stop for us. You know, that we can't have those kinds of inconsistencies. So for us, environmental justice isn't just about the disparate impact of this. It's about food. It's about where we work, where we play, where we pray, where we live, and how we engage with each other. So I'm going to stop there so that we can have questions later, because I want to respect the time for the sisters who came to share their perspective about environmental justice. Gracias.
Okay, so I've prepared a presentation. Let me try and skim through it because it's quite big. My name is Sapery James. I'm from Papua New Guinea, the current reigning Miss Papua New Guinea. I'm not a beauty queen. I've used that as a platform to empower me to give voice, because in my country, women do not have a voice. So, environmental justice and women's vulnerability in Papua New Guinea. Now, Papua New Guinea is very different from your country. This is my first visit to the USA, to New York, and I'm blown away. You can't think in the context of your thinking for the United States. So I'm going to try and paint a picture on the current issues, on the rural life of women who are the most highly vulnerable to a whole range of issues, whether it be environmental justice, we have climate change in there, but we also have crazy political situation going on at the moment. So I want to paint this picture to give you the broad spectrum of vulnerability that women face to do with environmental justice. So PNG women, they're so special, but yet so very vulnerable. We have a poverty trap that exists due to circumstances and disability. And when I say disability, it's not just physical disability, it's social disability, it's political disability, environmental ruralness, remoteness disability. So it's a range of these disabilities that create this poverty trap, which make Papua New Guinea women so vulnerable. We have a current PNG environment. This is what I call the environment. This is politics, social, cultural, the natural environment playing, inequality and gender violence, which I'll bring into play, a health situation, the health environment, and the educational environment. Then I'll paint a picture on PNG current issues. So we have this land grabbing. I'm currently attending the CSW and the UN, the Commission Status of Women, and this was one of the very first issues that was brought up. It's not just happening in Papua New Guinea, but in African countries. There's a huge amount of land grabbing going on by foreign multinational corporations that are just coming in, grabbing up huge chunks of land, and in my country, you will see that makes women very vulnerable. So we have a resource boom. In my country, I just see a huge amount of international corporations coming in and snapping up resources, whether it be gold, whether it be gas, our forestry. So I see there's a big problem with unsustainable development. So then I'll finish it with women and going forward to a better future. So education empowerment from the grassroots level. And I'll talk a bit about the current situation in PNG with women in politics, and what we're trying to do is push through these 22 seats and get this Women's Equity Bill through Parliament. So just II, Japan came, and then Australia and UK took over and gave it to Australia. So we're colonised by Australia. You can see mountainous terrain, ruggedness, remoteness. Now, current PNG, we're still very much isolated, disconnected to the outside world. Villages, communities up here are so remote. There's very poor road connectivity. Airlines are monopolised. The cost of flying from where I live in Port Moresby, it's cheaper for me to go to Australia than for me to fly home to Cape and New Island. So there's these issues, and it creates problems, because how can the government put in services when you have poor transport, poor infrastructure on a whole lot of levels? It makes it for a very crazy situation. And in Papua New Guinea, we're so diverse. We have over 800 different languages, many, many different cultures. I come from New Ireland, so these islands up here, we're really remote. I come from New Hanover out here. We have how many different languages? You can have a different dialect of that language if you go a kilometre down the road. So, diversity. So this is a bilum. A bilum is what a woman carries on her shoulder. We weave it, we carry out things, it empowers a woman. That I want to use this to show this is crazy diversity, crazy connectivity. PNG, the environment, the culture, politics, everything. So just to paint this picture. I'll go through a picture collage just to continue painting this picture. Now this is an elderly woman in the Highlands region, a mama. She has lived, she has survived. In the extreme rural areas, malaria, childbirth. We don't have rural health services. For this lady to live to this age, she's very strong, fit to survive such harsh conditions. She's happily weaving away, weaving a bilum for her livelihood. PNG women are very innovative. Here again, the bilum. Designs in colour. In the Highlands, women bilum makers are renowned for their styles and colour. This handy tool has many purposes, whether to put a baby to sleep, to put vegetables in, to go to the markets, to carry everyday goods. This bilum signifies and empowers women on a daily basis. Here, this photo of women carrying her goods to the marketplace. She's carrying bananas on her back, she's carrying more vegetables. The strength of a woman depicted here in this picture. Her bread and butter, it comes from the environment, the earth around her. Bananas, vegetables from a garden. If she has access to her land rights, she can sustain her livelihood. If she does not have a healthy, clean environment, that's an environment that's degraded, she cannot sustain her livelihood. Again, women play a pivotal role in feeding a family, in a community, with feasting and preparations for traditional, for death, for ceremony purposes, for customary values and beliefs. Women keep our traditions and our culture thriving and alive. They're the backbone. Women are the backbones to communities of Papua New Guinea. They're caregivers and give wholly to families, communities, their clans, and on the whole, the whole country. Women, again, with access to land rights and resources for empowerment, can take part in agriculture. Here, this woman in the Highlands, again, in a market, selling her chickens. If she has land and she has a little bit of resources, she can farm. She can produce chickens for her livelihood. Women are fantastic caretakers and entrepreneurs. Again, we move from the Highlands to the coastal areas. Women in the coastal areas rely solely on coral reefs, healthy mangrove systems, and a healthy marine environment in general. We can see mud crabs here and cockles. Women in the coastal island areas rely solely on fisheries resources. Coastal women having access to a healthy, clean marine environment, such as coral reefs that are flourishing, gives them empowerment. their livelihood. This remote mother, she's been out fishing all day. With her 2 children, she's paddled out to the reef out there. She's caught a fish. She will take this fish to the town. She will sell it for about 30 kina. You halve that, you get about US dollars approximate. She will go to a store then and buy tin fish, salt, basic needs for subsistence and survival. Now again, she has her livelihood because reefs are intact, reefs are healthy. I want you to see this close connectivity with the environment. The most vulnerable people in my country are the women, and they're so closely connected and reliant on the environment. Again, women take part in all different trades. Here, a woman's pumping and selling fuel. PNG women are very capable. PNG women are strong. They take part in heavy labour. They work the garden every day. PNG women are resilient. Now this lady, she's washed her clothes. She was donated a tank by, I think, AusAid. She's able to wash her clothes. If she doesn't have that tank, all women in remote rural communities in PNG have to go to rivers and streams to collect their drinking water, to wash their clothes, to get water for what they wash their food and cook in. They're directly using and utilising the natural environment. They don't have the luxury to turn on a tap like here in New York City. They rely directly on the environment. Again, an elderly woman here. We're moving on to another region in PNG, in the Islands region. She's weaving a basket to carry vegetables. Sweet potatoes to the market. Again, I stress that rural women that make up the 90% of PNG women are heavily reliant on the environment. PNG women are mothers at the end of the day, looking after their children, a priority in the communities. PNG women are proud of their culture and embrace traditional sing-sings. Here I show you a Highlands woman, and she's adorned, and this is traditional customary dance. Everything you see here is derived from the land, from the environment, from the feathers on her head to the paints that she's wearing on her face. They're from river rocks or from seeds in the rainforest. This is our heritage, this is our culture, it's from the environment. We don't have, if our environment's degraded, yet in PNG we also embrace a Western education. This is a photo of a young girl, a high school student. However, in the majority of rural areas in Papua New Guinea, most young girls finish school at the age of, at the grade of grade 8, 12 years, 13 years. Because of lack of money, lack of income to pay for their school fees, or because their parents say, no, your brothers will get first preference, sorry, you stay back, you'll help me garden, you'll help me take care of the family. But yet PNG women are savvy. Here is a young girl that I trained up to be a coastal fisheries survey. She's a school dropout, a grade 8 school dropout, but I trained her up. She was my master's research assistant for my master's. PNG women, highly educated. Here are some uni students, some girls that were students of mine that I was teaching. Young, very capable ladies. Only 10 to 15% of girls will reach this in PNG, maybe less, 5%. Again, very capable. Now we have some women leaders. Dame Carol Pidu, it's a shining light. She's our one sole lady in parliament, in politics. So after that slideshow, I hoped I've painted a picture. I've painted the picture of how women are closely connected and reliant on the environment. I'm talking to rural women, the mass majority, the most vulnerable women in my country. However, we face great impediments, health, gender issues, and cultural attitudes. So we talk about these cultural attitudes, which are seen as cultural norms and traditions. The majority of Papua New Guinea women are extremely vulnerable due to this poverty trap, this inability to to improve their lifestyle because of their ruralness, their remoteness, the lack of income generating streams. We have agriculture and fisheries. Women in PNG have a strong society, traditional and cultural norms, social values. I showed you that in those pictures. Their roles in their community and their family. However, currently PNG is at a crossroads where we have strong traditional values versus contemporary forms of development and change, which in the last few years I have seen huge change. We have this modernisation that these rural women are facing. It's a cash grab. They don't have a high level of education to understand financial literacy, to count, to access that market, to improve their income. Education is low. The dilemmas facing women, gender violence is serious in Papua New Guinea, and the South Pacific gender violence is the worst in my country. Me, myself, as I've experienced. Since living in Port Moresby don't know, is the third worst city to live in the world. I've been carjacked, I've been attacked, I've had guns to my head. Gender violence is a huge issue in Papua New Guinea. Women face it on a daily basis. These women actually go to the market to sell their goods, face gender violence at the markets. Again, agriculture and coastal fisheries play a main role in supporting women. Their livelihoods, their food security, their cash income generation. This is what empowers women in coastal island communities, but also in the highlands. This connectivity to the natural environment. This is what sustains the women, their livelihoods, their culture. So income, we know income improves capabilities and opportunities. So women, we talk about vulnerability. Women are vulnerable if they don't have income earning opportunities. Economic situation for majority of rural women is very poor. Women's contribution to the national economy at all levels is high, yet their labour efforts remain undervalued and underaccounted for. So a woman's ability to earn income, contribute financially, enables her to participate more actively in the household decision making. However, for the majority of women in PNG, the vast majority, they're silent. They don't have a voice. Decision making to the larger extent for the majority of women in PNG is without a choice. The men make the decisions. Most women do not have the ability to earn income, otherwise income is entirely used up and spent in just meeting their basic needs for their family, their obligations. Women's income is usually spent entirely on family needs, whereas the men, their income is spent on recreational sense and purpose. So constraints to women's industry and development. Again, there's poor communication, poor access to information because of ruralness. Literacy level is poor. The need to address poor marketing systems. So I say women in the rural areas. So for my islands, coastal fisheries, they have mud crabs, they have oysters, they have shells, these high value fisheries products, but yet inefficient transport system, poor access to information on marketing and how to value add. There's high literacy rate. There's poor extension services because of remoteness. And again, it comes back to changing the cultural norms or the attitudes of the men. Women are very vulnerable because of this inequality, the treatment of women, that women aren't good enough, that they're not valued enough. So again, I come to the islands because that's my experience, right? This lady, she has to come 3 hours to sell her fish goods. She transports her fish goods to the markets. She sells her fish, but the cost of fuel is going up in my islands. We have inflation overall across the country. We have this huge Exxon project, this gas, multi-billion, it's going to double the GDP in my country over the next coming years. But it's pushing in the remote rural areas. There's resource shortages fuel, across the board. And so it's pushing inflation, and the basic cost of living is going up in rural PNG because of, so she has to sell her goods to buy medicines, example, anti-malarials, and all of this. And what is wrong with this picture? Food security. We have huge problems in our islands, on small islands that are now heavily overpopulated, and the reefs have been overfished. Now you add climate change into that picture. Now I have this issue too, which I hope you're following me, and I'm painting this picture. The losses of livelihood from environmental degradation, displacement of land, land degradation, unsustainable resource use, collapse of fishery stocks, reduced access to clean water, all form a special place of growing importance in the poverty scape in my country. Coastal islands in PNG, also in mountains, questions sustainable livelihoods. So environmental degradation plus climate change is going to be a huge problem when we talk about food security in the future. So environmental degradation, climate change, what I'm witnessing from my experience and talking with other people is a rapid loss of biodiversity in our islands. We're a tropical developing nation. We're once pristine. Coral reefs in my islands were voted #1 in the world for scuba diving. Now, the numbers of scuba divers coming to New Ireland because of this flourishing coral reef is going down. Shark populations going down. There's a really famous reef up in my islands, Valerie's Reef, before it had a huge population of sharks, of silvertips, very famous. No longer there. We have agriculture, oil palm, logging. We have a special case at the moment in my country where we have this huge land grabbing. Over 5 million hectares have been snapped up overnight, pushed through. Communities all around the country have lost their land rights for 99 years. It's been signed over to various logging organisations or companies. So agriculture, pork, palm oil, logging impacts and deteriorates coastal waters, the water quality, sedimentation, the nutrient fertilizer, pesticide runoff from palm oil plantations impacts coral reefs. I know pesticides and herbicides for coral recruitment and coral settlement doesn't allow that if it's on reefs. Overfishing and fishing pressures and destructive fishing methods, plus the pressure of poverty to feed families, all further threaten coral reef marine environment.
Sorry. Yeah, I was asked to moderate at the last minute, so I'm sorry for being so. It's just that we wanted to make some time for questions and answers, and Tanya, I know I talked extremely fast.
Yeah.
So I just, as you're talking, I'm thinking, oh my God, there were 20 things I didn't say. So if you could wrap up,
Yeah,
and also if there is a website that they can access this information directly, I think that would actually be really cool.
Okay, this is just taken from my master's research in 2009. We had a natural tidal surge disaster which inundated all of the islands up here, complete islands that people, communities had to be relocated. So I was looking at the impact down this east coast. I had a number of sites, and what this impact did, a 2-day event, tidal sea surge, was completely uplift the entire coral reef off the base bedrock. Now you think about these extreme weather events and climate change, which predicts more extreme weather events, what the consequences are for food security for people living in island communities, such as in PNG, but in the South Pacific. So again, I'm just trying to say how vulnerable women are in my country because of their reliance on the environment and fisheries. So speeding up our current political situation, we're trying to get 22 seats through in the PNG Parliament, and we are unable to do that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Papua New Guinea government, but we had one government take over the other, and we've had fractioning and two prime ministers arguing, I'm prime minister, no, I'm prime minister. And during this time, we've been trying to push through 22 seats. And they just voted against it just recently, so we've had no hope of getting it through this year. So if we had more women in these political positions, perhaps we could help address some of the issues that women are facing. If we have a women voice up there in that decision-making level, I think that is the key problem in my country, that it's all men, it's a men's world. They decided on this, it was approved, this land grabbing, these 99 year leases. And this is a huge issue because women no longer have the rights to their land, and this is going to have huge consequence in my country. The big resource boom is creating social havoc. To sum up, violence and vulnerability on women. There's been research gender studies on where the money from the royalties go from big gas and mining projects. The men spend it all at the pokies, women, and booze. And it increases gender violence. And then we had HIV into the picture. So we have this crazy situation. So again, environmental land degradation from unsustainable land practices and all other social and environmental problems with the above. So very complicated picture that I've tried to paint for you guys in a really quick time, but so I'll finish it up there.
Good afternoon. So I cheated a little bit. I deliberately wanted to go last because I knew that Elizabeth would do such a wonderful job using her experience to really frame environmental justice and give a really holistic context of what that is. And Rachel did a fantastic job of really talking about the sort of gender-specific vulnerability of what environmental justice looks like. And I have to say that the women that you talked about in P&G could very much be the women of the South Bronx. They could very much be the women of Brooklyn. They could very much be the women of Jamaica, Queens, right? There are parallels that exist. I have a really shit outfit, I'm trying to stand up. Talk to y'all for a second. And so they could very well be any of those demographics. So there is this, I went to Baruch and I was a political science major, surprise, surprise. And there is this theory called the feminization of poverty. It's very controversial. And there are people who will insist that it does not exist. I will tell you, as a low-income mother living in the South Bronx, it absolutely does exist. It exists because we are subjected to gender-biased social service agencies. It exists because we are subjected then to racist policies that enable that, right? I really want to focus on, in the 15 minutes that I'm going to talk before we turn it over to dialogue, because that's what I like about panels. I hate feeling like I have to dictate anything to anyone and rather just talk to y'all, people to people, and so that we can have an exchange of ideas. But I want to set the stage for the kind of conversation that we're going to have. And the kind of conversation that I want to have is that in this description of this, what really made me excited is that there is a line that talks about community empowerment, right? How do we empower the community? How do we talk about justice? What does that look like? I can give you all the statistics on my community. I'm not going to. You probably all know how to use Google, and you can look it up. And the reality is that my community is a resilient one. And so I don't want to sit here and talk to you about how many people have diabetes. I don't want to talk to you about how many folks are going hungry, right? I want to talk to you about what folks like myself and Elizabeth and Rachel are actually doing about those issues, right? Women are extremely capable, right? Communities, particularly in urban communities, and now I just learned something about P&G, clearly in rural communities internationally, because of what we see, and at least I speak from my experience, the cradle prison pipeline that victimizes so many of our young men, right? And the social service agencies that, in my opinion, this is another conversation that we should probably have over a couple shots of tequila, right? Social service agencies have come in and completely demolished the black family in the 60s and the 70s, what you then get are women-led poor communities. And that poverty is continually perpetuated by lack of health care, lack of access to progressive family planning services that are culturally relevant, right? We don't talk about that piece. We think if there's a Planned Parenthood, then the needs of people in the hood are being met, but they aren't, because you aren't taking into consideration the cultural aspects of those existing communities, and that there is not a one-size-fits-all to health care and family planning in a non-homogenized society, right? We are looking at the fact that when we talk about workforce development, much of it is very specifically geared towards men, right? And we're starting to see some places like, Elizabeth, help me out, what's the name of this organization? Is it non-traditional employment for women? I think the acronym is.
They've been around for a really long time.
Right, so they've been around for a while, and they're probably one of the few games in town that talk specifically to women and getting them into places that they would not necessarily be, construction, things like that. But what happens to the woman who just, you know, I like these 4-inch heels. I am not putting on a pair of work boots and getting on anybody's scaffolding any day of the week, right? And we're a lot of times not seeing a lot of solutions that are then led by the women in the communities who are the most affected. And then when we do see those, like Elizabeth started to really sort of touch upon, they get co-opted, they get swallowed up, they get overwhelmed with other folks that come in the nonprofit industrial complex and say, there's some grant money for this. We've been doing this 15 years. Although this is not something we were doing before, we're suddenly going to do food justice versus working with an organization like myself that says, we're going to help augment you. We're going to help supplement the work that you're doing, right? And so there are all those barriers and all those challenges. But you're really, I think we're at a really key point in where we are as this country, right? There are folks who are like, we're going to hell in a handbasket, we're in gasoline underwear, and then there are folks like myself who are just a little bit more optimistic, that thinks that this is the peak, this is the valley before the peak, that this is really a transformational time, that there's a time that is arising, particularly for grassroots organizations that are really going to step up and lead their communities, right? And that the folks who have been doing this work for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, like Uprose, are really going to be the folks who are leading the kind of transformation that we need to see. So in 2009, I started the BLK ProjeK. I had worked for the last 5 years with Mothers on the Move, with Sustainable South Bronx. Ultimately, the last job that I had working for anyone was with Majora Carter, who is a South Bronx environmentalist, the Majora Carter group. And there were some things that I was starting to really struggle with in that movement, right? And a lot of them Elizabeth already talked about. I was also feeling like that I was the anecdote that everybody talked about when I went into a room. And there was no one, everyone wanted to speak on behalf of me, but there wasn't a platform for me to speak for myself. I'm a mom, 31 years age, I have 4 children. I managed to put myself through a CUNY, I managed to graduate, I managed to get my own car, I managed to get my own apartment. I also managed to survive welfare and displacement. And then I managed to start my own organization. And that story was not being told by people who look like me. I would go into meetings and it'd be a really nice, well-meaning white woman who had a beautiful slideshow with pictures of people like me, but we weren't in the room, right? And there was this there is this missionary ideology to thinking about empowerment, right? There is this, let's save the natives type of mentality that happens. And I don't say that to trivialize any of the work that's being done, but it's about checking your privilege. It's about understanding that equality is only going to come if you are willing to say that my privilege cannot be had on the backs of somebody else's disparity. That is where things start to get sticky. We can all sit in the room and sing Kumbaya and say we want all these wonderful things for folks, but if I say, well, then you're gonna have to give up something so my community can get this, people are like, whoa, wait a minute now, get a little crazy. And so these are the conversations that we need to talk about when we're talking about environmental justice, when we're talking about empowerment. It is my personal opinion that if you are talking about equality for poor communities without talking about a long-term economic financial stability plan, then you are doing a disservice to the work that you are doing. So in my community, we've now started to work on a farmer's market. And not a traditional farmer's market. I should probably stop calling it a farmer's market. We want to work on a community-led produce market. I also want to talk about the connection that, I just want to take a quick digression and just say, it's not just women. When you talk about women in poor communities, most of the time it heads the household, so you talk about the children too. So, Elizabeth's organization, Uprose, has already been doing a great job with youth development. So that's something that we started to think about. It's not just saying that we want to do economic development for marginalized women, but we want to do economic development for marginalized women and youth. When we start talking about barriers to employment for low-income women, you damn sure better start talking about their kids. Because if I've got to choose between my low-paying wage job and the fact that my kid has got a fever between 100 and 101 degrees, that's the reality, that I've got to do that. If I've got to think about the fact that I can't really afford childcare, and so I'm going to leave them with someone who may have more kids than they can handle, or these kids are getting juicy juice and peanut butter and jelly all day, and by the time I get them, they might be a little dirty, they might be a little hyped up, they might be tired, or they sat inside all day long because they couldn't be taken outside, because this one woman is taking care of 9 kids, and there's no way she can walk them to the park. This is the reality that many mothers are faced with. Many of them will then go to social service agencies, welfare. Welfare says, we're going to put you in a back-to-work program. We're not progressive. We're not going to ask you what it is that you want to do. We're not going to give you the necessary skills that you need to do it. I was in college. I had 2 young children, 17 months apart. Social science major. I am 25 credits away from graduating, and welfare told me, you need to quit that and go into a vocational program, or we will sanction you. And they held up that bargain. They sanctioned me. They took away all the money in order for me to be able to take care of my family. I had to go through what they call a fair hearing. That takes 90 days to get an appointment. Then you go, and if you win the fair hearing, which I did, it takes them 60 days to reinstate. In the interim, now I'm in housing court, right? In the interim, I come home, and now the marshal has changed the lock on my door. And I've got to explain to my daughter that we don't live here for right now. Hopefully we may be able to get in, but we may end up living someplace else. These are the obstacles that poor women in communities are dealing with. And a lot of times, the tea baggers, Tea Party, they have all this rhetoric that uses the us and them language. They have a right to be angry. There's certainly a lot of welfare happening in this country. But the welfare that's bleeding this country dry has nothing to do with $109, and that's what you get every 2 weeks for a family of 3, $109, and food stamps of about $400 is not bleeding this country dry. The welfare that's bleeding this country dry has much more to do with the corporate welfare that we're giving folks who are job creators, but they're not job creators. And so you're talking about a lack to health care, a lack of child care, a lack to family planning services, a lack of healthy things in the communities, right? They use the term food desert for my community, but I would say it's a food swamp. There's a lot of things to eat. Not a lot of it is very good, however. The USDA in its own food desert report also said that we've got to start thinking more innovatively about how we address food security. Right? There's this tendency to pathologize the things that happen in poor communities of color. Well, folks are not eating together. I was bused to school, mainly white friends, affluent, live on the Upper West Side. They didn't eat together either. And there were no public service announcements to talk to them about that. What the USDA then said, and which I agreed with, was when we really started to think about how we were going to create better food choices in our community so people could get healthy, but then also make sure that they're making money off of it. Because I don't want to advocate for Trader Joe's to come into my community. I don't want to advocate for Whole Foods or Whole Paychecks to come into my community. Because that means that gentrification is probably right on the heels of that. I was gentrified out of Harlem. I saw that whole process happen. And it doesn't happen overnight. It probably happened started to happen when I was about 10, when they started rezoning things. And by the time that I was 21, the community around me had changed, and there wasn't a place for me or my family in it. So what we need is to make sure that we have access to the resources that are going to give people in the community to be able to use the knowledge that they already have, right? There's this misconception that we need to be educated. No, it's probably already part of our ancestral DNA. Maybe a reminder or a refresher course, or maybe just access to the actual resources. I live in a primarily Latin community. Many of these people have come from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, with access of all these things that they did in their home country that they no longer now have access to in this country. One of the biggest ones probably being land. We've been trying for 2 years with the help of the city councilwoman to start an urban farm, right? And I don't say community garden, I say urban farm. We want to raise chickens, keep bees, grow food, create added value products, create cooperatives that will then be responsible for that, and then sell those things, both low end and high end. It's been 2 years and we have not been able to do that. Although I live in a community that has a 49% land vacancy rate. It's not that the land is not there. It's that the municipal government says you can't have access to it. And so it is those types of things that create a sort of apathy or anger or resentment and are challenges to folks like us in terms of organizing our community. And so what has to happen is that I don't consider myself a leader. I consider myself a catalyst or a contagion. I walk into a room and I get amped and people say, here comes the crazy hippie lady. And I start talking about food and vegetables. And then I tap into what those folks need and allow them to be at the forefront of that. I'm not the expert. People routinely knock on my door and say, I have a housing issue, can you help me? I don't do housing, I have no idea how to help. But I will allow them to come into my apartment and use my computer. I have women who come to me and say, well, what kind of herbs do I use because my kid is pink eye? I don't know, my thumb is not green, it's more like a mustard color. But we can figure this out together. And so part of empowerment is just about building community, about having humility and understanding, saying, I don't know everything, I don't pretend to know everything, and I can help you and we can learn it together. Or there are lots of times when people will say, well, when you get that urban farm going, then I'll come and help you. And I say, no, I need you to help me get the urban farm going right now. And so it's also about pushing people past their comfort zone, helping them to realize that every one of us in our community is a leader. And then it's about organizing and putting accountability on those who are the gatekeepers to the resources. Fresh Direct wants to come into my community. And it's promising, and it's getting $137 million for the possibility, not the guarantee, but the possibility that it may employ 1,000 people over the next 20 years. However, they said they'll try to take food stamps, and they'll think about delivering to the folks in my community. Although the 16,000 truck trips that happen every day up Bruckner Expressway and the Sheridan and the Cross Bronx to get to Riverdale has contributed to the 2 asthmatic children that I have. Both of whom were hospitalized before they were a year old and on a nebulizer by the time they hit the 18-month mark. And when we come in and we give you some of those jobs, they're not going to be managerial. We're not making any promises or putting anything on paper that we're going to make sure that we incubate a career track for some of the people. They will get the same types of low-wage jobs they would get anyplace else, working at the mailroom in corporate America. And so when we talk about green jobs, I often want to push the conversation further to talk about green businesses. How do we not only just catalyze local food in my community, a local food system, how do we catalyze a local economy? I get jealous every time Elizabeth talks about the fact that she lives in a community where they can walk to work. Because Hunts Point used to look like that, and now it doesn't. That left with white flight. And what was left were those structures, and what they put in those structures were dirty technologies. We have a 5-acre park that is sandwiched between a water treatment facility and the processing plant that would treat 71% of the municipal city's waste. Sludge, shit. Let's call it what it is. And it would come by not the waterfront that it sat on, but through a truck with a blue tarp on it. And then it would sit outside of that organic fertilizer company and idle for half an hour. So do you know what my community smelled like 15 years? Shit. What kind of psychological impact does it have on the people that live there? They felt like shit. And do you know what NYAFCO, the New York Organic Fertilizer Company, which with Mothers in the Move, we got shut down? But it took us 15 years. You know what sat next to it? A jail. And do you know what they wanted to put on the parking lot of that jail? Another jail. Because the reality is, with all that stuff, nothing's in a vacuum. Environmental justice is not just about air quality, and it's not just about water quality, it's about housing. It's about criminal justice, right? Because they look at the reading grades in certain communities and they decide where they're gonna put the jails. In rural communities, they deliberately take the jobs out and then promise them that the only way they're gonna get jobs back is if we put a jail in your community. What they do then is create with environmental injustices, they create a cradle to prison pipeline. It's not a coincidence that in these communities you're seeing higher rates of reproductive health issues. That in these communities you're seeing higher rates of ADD, ADHD, and emotional behavioral problems. And then they tell you little Tyrone's just that way because you're poor and you're black. No, little Tyrone is that way because there's a smokestack sitting in his backyard and he can't breathe. And the next thing you know, then you have an educational school system that is not equipped to deal with those issues. And before you know it, he's dropped out. And if there aren't communities like ours, then he ends up in prison. And so the reality is that I'm saying that when we do this work, we've got to understand that it's multi-tiered, that it's complex, that it just doesn't come from a farmer's market, it just doesn't come from an urban farm, but it makes sure that we create collectives and coalitions that have equity, that include, and there's a difference between diversity and inclusion, that's another conversation, but that these coalitions are inclusive, meaning that the people in the community who are most affected are at the forefront of the decision-making process and the strategies to remedy these issues. And in that, we're also making sure that there's an economic plan that's attached to it. It's not just enough to say that we're going to get these things out of your community and then you're going to still be as poor as you were when they were here. And in the meantime, the 10 or 12 people that it did employ in the community have lost their jobs. There has to be a viable economic plan that is attached to them. In a community that's ours, that has to exist.
Thank you. We have a small amount of time for questions and answers, but I kind of feel that I think I talk so fast and so little that there are some areas that I sort of glossed over, and I feel it would be irresponsible of me not to talk about those things, so I'm just going to do that quickly. You are really essential to the environmental justice movement because it is multi-layered, it's complex, and we have to be really strategic. Because we are doing things like measuring air emissions and talking about the nexus between that contamination and the health of our community. And because the right to breathe is the most fundamental thing there is. And if we can't breathe, we can't fight for good schools, for jobs, for any of that. And we do need to think about how we transition our small businesses into the green economy, how we retain manufacturing and provide them with the resources that they need so that they can go green instead of bringing in new industries that are going to displace those businesses that are there. In our community walks to work, but it's next to 11 power plants that go on this expressway and numerous brownfields. And so our communities are all very similarly situated. And when we talk about youth development, we don't talk about youth development, we talk about youth organizing. We believe that leadership is a continuum and that you don't have to wait to exercise it, but it does come with accountability and responsibility, and we are accountable to a base. So we have to be in the process of base building. We think that it is extremely important for us that you understand how privilege can prevent a coalition or community building from going forward, but that there are certain things that you bring to the table, like technical expertise, that is necessary. We need to have people who can tell us how particulate matter 2.2 is going to affect the narrow air passages of our children. And we need someone who can model what a plan is for our community and tell us where there's going to be displacement, what the emissions are going to be, how that's going to affect our health, whether it's close to the schools. That modeling has to happen. Most of us don't have or don't come from a background where we even took an environmental policy class. I'm a lawyer, right? And I mentioned that, and I said that I came from struggle. I didn't tell you that my father was a junkie, that he died at Hunts Point at the age of 50. I didn't tell you that. I didn't tell you that becoming a lawyer and becoming educated was my act of defiance. because we believe that our young people are not at risk, that they are at potential. And we say that to you because when we measure success, we measure from where people begin and what their trajectory is. And so we are not suffering from poor self-esteem. We people who think we're pretty badass, you know, we try not to be colonized, and we try not to suffer from internalized racism. So we feel really confident that we've got a multiplicity of skills, but people in our community who don't have access to a formal education are absolutely brilliant. My grandmother did not know how to read or write and could do some mental math that would blow your mind. And I share that with you because we take what we learn and how we're conditioned into our communities and not value what people bring to the table. We facilitated a process where we had a group of Chinese women who didn't speak English communicating with a group of Mexican women who didn't speak English. It was the coolest thing I ever saw, how they came together and created a design of a greenway. And by the way, the Chinese have been here for a minute, and Mexicans own half the United States, and Puerto Ricans came through through Brooklyn in the 1800s, and that's a workshop for another day. So we've been here. We got a lot of history here. Having people, and then I also want to mention Black and Puerto Rican youth specifically, because African American and Puerto Rican youth, young men, are lagging behind every single racial and ethnic group in New York City, including recent immigrants. They are lagging behind recent immigrants for a lot of different reasons. And so we have to take care of our boys. I'm a mother. I have a son, I have 5 brothers, and we have to take care of them. And in terms of the prisons, I have a little disagreement with Tanya because I actually thought having a prison in the community was a good thing. And the reason is that a lot of times when our families have to travel really far, the people who are institutionalized, disconnected from family, they become institutionalized. They don't have access to their lawyers. They don't have access to their advocates. And so we can't deny that we've got people in prison. We do. And that's, I was going to say a bad word, but profanity is the language of the powerless, and I was having a powerless moment. And so it was going to come out. And so it's messed up, right? So there are disagreements, honestly, between our communities, and part of the disagreements come out from us having to be saddled with all of the burdens and none of the amenities. And as I mentioned in my opening, when we do get the amenities, we get displaced. I was displaced 5 times as a child. I went to 5 schools in 8 years, all right? So these are things that are happening on an everyday basis, and the fact that I'm here today is because I am resilient and because it was an act of defiance. Now, leadership, I would say, yeah, I am a leader, and I am because I have to take positions, and I have to represent a base, and I have to listen to the base, and I completely agree that all of us have that responsibility. But working with each other and talking about interdependentness, how we do that is going to require a commitment to self-transformation. It's going to require that you look deep inside and talk and think honestly about your isms and your limitations, whether they be race, class, or whatever. And really make a commitment to anti-racism and working in a very different way. It means being comfortable with maybe leadership looking like us. And being comfortable with that and that being okay. You know, if you look at the staff at my organization, just go to the website and look at the staff, you're gonna say, wow, there's a little bit of everything there. We call it sancocho, right? Where everything keeps its flavor, but together it's this amazing stew, right? I get horizontally gifted by not appreciating things like sancocho. So I just want, before we break into questions and answers, that you just really have an opportunity, if you're inspired by anything or moved by anything, think about your lives and think about the fact that this issue of climate justice and environment is right here, and that the most vulnerable communities are going to be wiped out, that they're going to be put in a place where they're not going to be able to recover. Think New Orleans, and think about what's happening in New Orleans, which is a level of gentrification that will blow your mind. In Sunset Park, they call the folks pioneers. When people come into our community and they call themselves pioneers, it takes me back in time. I'm like, oh my God, we're being recolonized again? And they're using the same language. They're discovering a community of 130,000 people? Wow, that's huge. I mean, that they're comfortable with the language. So your actions, what you do, what you write, what your policy is, what you research, all of that really matters in creating an environment of people who respect each other and work with each other in a very different way. So I'm going to stop right there and take questions, because we have 15 minutes, people. Okay. You want to go first?
I don't know if I have questions as much as I do comments. This is the first time I'm hearing about people and I did hear about sustainability in South Florida before. concerns is, this whole issue of empowerment and, educating yourself. The information is not really getting to the people who need to hear it. I attend a lot of these lectures. I love to listen to them, college educated or not. I just feel that the information and the resources are contained. And where we are, like right here, with Barnard and Columbia, down the street where there are numerous amounts of people who would benefit from this type of conference, from this type of information, the people in the communities that are being trampled on don't have access to the information. I live in a low to moderate income community, housing, and I am fighting tooth and nail to try to get information to the people who are at times complacent. They don't have the hope, and it's just really hard to get to connect the information
So I wanna
why
answer
it
that.
matters,
So
why it matters.
there are a number of reasons
to you.
why, there's a number of reasons why people aren't getting information. First, we have done some amazing, powerful things in our community, like we stopped the siting of a power plant, we doubled the amount of open space. I told you when we passed all this legislation, but we are still a small grassroots organizations, mainstream environmental organizations that are usually white-led and male-led get all of the funding. We get less than 1% across the board nationally. EJ organizations are doing the grassroots work. Big organizations are doing studies on the work that we're doing, and they'll do a study on something we did that was transformational. They'll get 75,000 and we'll get maybe 10,000 while we did the work on the ground. So there is a tremendous amount of disparity in terms of the funding that we get. Institutions led by people of color get less funding than institutions that are not. So if my organization, Uprose, was led by someone white, chances are they may be throwing money because, oh my God, look at this wonderful thing that they're doing as an urban contemporary missionary in this community. The fact that I come from there and that I had a choice, that I could have been making money, doesn't really matter, right? That's how the money comes. So it makes it, what happens is that there's a lack of capacity. And that capacity makes it impossible for us to be able to reach as many people as we'd like to. We do have in the summer the New York City Climate Justice Youth Summit, where we have about 300 young people coming from all over the city to learn not just about climate justice and the language, but also to volunteer so that they can actually be in different communities all over the city doing the work on the ground. Our young professionals have a tendency to like to talk and go to conferences and talk to each other and hang out and they talk and talk, but the work has to be done and the work is not as sexy as doing the talk, right? So we have to bring them in, and we can't bring them in because we can't hire them because we don't have the funding. So they get hired sometimes by mainstream organizations where they will not have any role in changing policy, they will not be nurtured, their growth will not be nurtured. And so we are, and I'm trying to talk fast because I want all these last questions, I know people may have them, I'm going to interject. So, but I wanted to tell you the money thing is real. And so, and now with the economy, it's shrinking. And we're trying to be really creative about how we get the message out, using all kinds of social networks and video and everything to do it, because it is hard. And it's hard across the country. I can tell you, our brothers and sisters out in LA, in Detroit, down in New Orleans, the Vietnamese community, they're all gonna tell you the same thing. So that's you hear, and so you're multiplied and you can get the message out to others.
And Pam, can I say, I'm in an organization, I've come in contact with a lot of racism that happens through funding. I'm just gonna call it what it is. It's racism. And it happens a lot. And nobody's calling me a nigger anymore. And nobody calls me gal, right? But it's like what that senator said about obscenity. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, right? And this is very similar when I worked in the corporate sector. But what I've gotten, and I know that's the reality, and while on the back end, there are simultaneous things with other organizations that we try to do to organize around that, to change that, the reality is still the reality. And one of the great things about me being a single mom who put myself through school, it taught me a life lesson for starting this organization, right? As a woman of color in a marginalized community who I ain't never been used to having money. Like, I didn't have money when I needed to, when I started raising my babies and being in school, and now having this organization, I ain't got no money there either. And so we try to find, so I've been trying really innovative things. And what I say is I learned a lesson from others on the move too, getting down and dirty, right? I door knock, right? I call myself the executive director of this organization of me and 2 interns, and I still go out there and I door knock, right? Because the reality is, while I do use Twitter and I do use Facebook, it's the people in this room that read up on that. The single mom who probably, the digital divide is, at least in the urban setting, is getting smaller, but what the digital medium is being used for may not have anything to do with liberating oneself. It may have more to do with using it as an extension of television and checking out. And so I need to go into NYCHA and I have to knock on a door. I have to go into the tenant buildings, I have to knock on the door. I have to stand outside of the houses that have gates on them and knock on the gate and ask the homeowner to come out and meet me at the gate so I can give them that stuff. I'm working with, I have some land upstate in Dutchess County, and so we're working on trying to do a sacred circle for moms. Get them out there, get them on a bio bus and talk about what that means if this bus runs on veggie oil, and talk to their kids about that, and get them on the land, and talk about healing. Because one of the things that we also talk about is the touchy-feely part. The fact that if I've been a victim of sexual violence, if I come from a cycle of poverty, if I'm dealing with people being incarcerated in my community, what is that doing to me psychologically? How can I then go and work a low retail and job and feel like I'm being subjected to a different type of abuse, right? And then how do I exert my power in that situation? Right? And so those things manifest itself as well and create barriers. And so we want to make sure that we're taking care of the whole person as we talk about moving through this space and this process. And so I feel you when you talk about that. I mean, there's such an irony that as a person who got gentrified out of Harlem, that I'm now sitting in Barnard talking about this, right? When we, let's be real, talk about some of the things that have been going on with Columbia University in Harlem, right? And land use. And so, but I also realize, I also say too, very quickly to wrap it up, is that I've also taken advantage of that, right? So the fact is that I spoke at Power Shift in DC, and these kids from Fordham University got up and said, how do I help you? I feel like being white is an issue when I go into the community to help you. And I said, well then why are you coming in my community to help me? Go to your community to help me. Right? Organize the cricket club or whatever it is that happens, right? Like go to those, because like racism, it's not only on the burden, it's not only the burden of those who are oppressed to end the ism. It is also the burden of those who enjoy the privilege to end the ism. And so there are folks who are organizing. We are organizing ourselves already. I need you to be on the Upper West Side creating allies so that we can create an equitable coalition. Y'all can't all swarm in here and think you're going to take care of us. I got this. Go over there, and you get that. And then we come together, we get it together.
we didn't send our young people to Power Shift. We didn't want them to be poster children, so we took it there. Yes.
I just want to say I'm a professor here, and when you mentioned scientists in their ivory towers, I'm one of them, and I have to say I am just as unhappy about being in that ivory tower as you are. And I come down out of it as much as I can. I live in the Bronx, and I know Helen, and I love Muslims, and
So I serve.
But I have a question for you, which is that, and this is kind of a little bit weird, but if you live in a vulnerable place, if you're coastal, if you're in a rural area, if you're in a poor area, you know that the environment is a disaster. You don't need the internet to tell you that your environment is a disaster. Now, if you are privileged, you are actually vulnerable to the dishonesty of the media, of the air conditioning that's keeping you comfortable on a blazing hot day. The ivory tower is its own vulnerability. We don't know the reality. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that. I mean, coming and giving a slideshow is one thing, but if I tell, my son's in 5th grade, and I'm always telling him, don't Google that, don't believe the first thing you see. Google climate change, and the first 5 hits are how climate change is a myth, right? And so how do you deal with that dishonesty? And then, like I said, if you're experiencing it firsthand, then you know it's a lie. But if you're not experiencing it firsthand, then you buy into the lie. I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, I'm still getting my head around it. How I put it into PG context. Can you try to ask the question?
I mean, I guess you have, it's just a question of how do you teach people who aren't experiencing firsthand? How do you convince them that the disaster ultimately is important to them and that they have to pay attention?
What I was trying to do with the whole PowerPoint presentation was paint a picture. And then at the end, I was trying to say that there is currently no environmental justice under the conditions of my country. And a lot of the decisions are being made outside of my country. America, Canada, big multinational corporations. And these decisions are impacting that down the line, and these women so vulnerable. The disconnectivity, it's a difficult situation.
I mean, I'm almost uplifted
And we
when
talk
a
about-
hurricane happens, because that finally gets our attention
Yeah.
about
But it's-
climate change.
But it's very altruistic. It's like, hey, guys,
Right. I mean,
from Columbia, let's get on a bus and go to Katrina and build a house. And then we'll come back here and we'll all feel really good about it, but there isn't any consistency. And you said, how do you, right? So what I say to you is that I don't,
Yeah.
but you do, because you already have the awareness. Like Elizabeth talked about the fact that, and Pam touched on the fact that there are people in our community who are complacent. I truly believe that inherently in there somewhere, there's a switch. And the trigger for everybody is different, right? So for you living in your community, the same way I know my community, you know your community. I can't come into your community and talk to folks about that because my story doesn't resonate. But you can be the mouthpiece in your community. And then you can say, once you organize a good core group of 5 or 10 or 15 folks, there is this woman in Brooklyn named Elizabeth Yeampierre who's doing this amazing thing. We should get with her to strategize on how we do X, Y, and Z on a citywide
Find
level.
common ground.
Right, exactly. But we all have to be these little beacons of leadership in our own communities. And then use the privilege that we have of our own internal resources of this club that I like to say that we're part of. Because like, yeah, these
Yeah, I mean,
conferences,
I see you
It's
have this
preaching to the choir.
unbelievable privilege of like the clear-sightedness on what your problems are
You know,
and what you might be able to do to solve them.
There is this
Need for self-transformation. You have to make a commitment to that. You have to, really, there has to be a cultural shift in how we consume. I just want to say something about low-income people, because if they're working 2 or 3 jobs, going home and cooking, the last thing they want to do is go to a meeting. So we have to provide them with childcare, we have to provide them with food and translation, and we have to create an environment that makes it possible for them to participate in a way that's meaningful. And so, those are some of the challenges. I don't think so much that people don't want to participate, but they just don't, they're just exhausted, right? And the other thing
I mean,
is,
first of all, you're not gonna go to a meeting.
I was
You're
at a
certainly not
panel,
gonna
I was
go
at a
to
panel
childcare.
with NRDC, where NRDC was complaining about consumption. And I'm thinking about women who suddenly are in this country who could never afford things before, and all of a sudden they got a lot of pairs of shoes. And you know, I'm not gonna judge them, because if they never have them, they really want them. So now what we need to do is sort of break them down and tell them, you know what? The thing is that the more we consume, the more we're going to make it impossible for your child. When you make the connection between the health of their children and their lifestyle, all of a sudden they get it. So it's sort of putting yourself in that place where these people are, not judging, because honestly, unless you've been poor, there's nothing more sustainable than a poor person. And I'm telling you, because I grew up that way, and we recycle because we have to, right? So, and then if you're coming from a place of privilege, there are all kinds of things you could do, but you have to come correct. You need to sort of examine your life. The National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, I serve on that environmental council, has a whole dialogue about how scientists are reshaping the way they're doing the work so that it resonates on the ground. So I'm sorry, I know I talk a lot, I'm trying to control myself, I get excited. Yes,
lady
like-
back here.
I absolutely love all of your presentations. I love the clarity, I love the directness of your vision. You said what needed to be said. Sometimes I come to these conferences and I feel that people talk around the issues, or they try to present a scholarly, analysis, but I love the work that you're doing, and I was really wanting to respond to what you said. I'm a kid of the 60s, and so the first thing you learn is to question authority. And you have to be willing to put yourself out there no matter what community you're in, which I've done, and you get ostracized, or people say you have a big mouth, you're too opinionated. I actually worked at Barnard for a while. I was a college archivist here, and I got into a lot of trouble over it because I would speak out on various things. At that time, it was very homophobic. It's much less so now. You have to just be willing. It's not only about coalition building, but it's about changing minds and hearts and all of that. And you just have to speak out from where you are, and you have to be willing. I mean, that's what a women's conference, women's studies, feminist studies, and doing all the work that we do, I mean, when you seem kind of confused about this, you actually know what you need to do, but you know that other faculty members or other administrators may say, oh, this is Barnard, and so, don't be so, upset about things and hold back, and, or like you were saying, the answer a lot of times that is given to us is we're supposed to go into other people's communities and help them. No, we're supposed to change ourselves and be an example, and of course you reach out, of course you do coalition building, but basically I wanted to just say that I just love everything that you're doing and keep it up. And I work in Austin, New York. I'm an activist and I work with green committees. And one thing I have to say that is so upsetting to me about green activism and green environmentalism is how the bigger organizations are getting bought out, whatever. The greenwashing that's going on.
Oh, yeah.
We have to talk about that at some point because it's really disastrous. Disastrous.
My name's Lawrence, and I have cerebral palsy, so about disabilities. Has any of you got to talk to these fetal person fanatics about the impact of environmental degradation on disabilities, that they're so fixated on these initiatives? I guess it could be lead poisoning, contaminants, mercury. I know there were some other things that were touched upon, because it was known that disabilities don't have to be physical. Obviously many are, but others are mental, psychological, cognitive.
Yeah, we do talk, because a lot of our young people have disabilities as a result of the exposure to a lot of the contamination in our community. And they start with either learning disabilities, sometimes emotional disabilities. There are studies that show that people are more violent when they're in an environment that's toxic. The EPA has done all this work on mercury, on lead paint. Our communities have lead legislation because some of our communities are on lead belts, and there's a lot of exposure to lead. There's a whole movement on green chemistry, and so there's a body of work on all of the different kinds of chemicals, the exposure, the impact in terms of someone's development. And then there are resources that deal specifically with people with different kinds of disabilities. So our organization works in solidarity with those groups because we don't have the capacity to be like an expert in everything. So you have to work with other folks that are. But in California, I know Physicians for Social Responsibility have done a tremendous amount of work on green chemistry. And I would suggest that you check them out because I think that they've really done really good work on that.
So there were folks that didn't say anything. I hope that everyone walked away with something that you can take back and that we were able to reach your hearts and minds and that there was something transformational that happened here today. When the women's movement happened, men were supposed to become more like us, and a lot of women became more like them, and we developed these male leadership styles. And one of the things that Tanya mentioned that I think really resonated with me is that our space is very different. We are mothers there, we are nurturing there, we have circles, we work in a very different way that is not linear, and we do think about the whole person and healing, and I think that was, for me, when you said that, that was very powerful because that doesn't fall within the models that you learn about in the classroom. You come to our organizations and we're impactful, but we do it in a very, I think, female way. There's something about the spirit of the
all right, now I am going to go to heavy mode. So, when we talk about the earth itself is feminine.
You're too young to be in
Right. No. I completely right. The earth's the cycles, all that. That's all that energy is very feminine. And when we talk about the environmental movement and environmental justice movement, you can't talk about it without acknowledging a lot of the patriarchy that runs rampant. One of the things that's not explicit in the mission of the Black Project, but is explicit in the way that we do things, is the fact that it is a very mother-centric place. I can't talk about working in a low-income community and not talk about the fact that it has to be a mother-centric place. That I'm working in a community where women or young women, or in some cases girls, are becoming mothers. And understanding that does not mean that your life is over, right? I really want to get out of and this is about talking about privilege. When we're talking about transformation, that transformational leadership, we also have to really start to check what we have internalized as the norms and the mores and all that kind of stuff in our communities. We have to stop being willing to pathologize whole groups of people and understand that we need to meet folks where they are. I can't stand on 125th Street and yell up the block to tell you to come down here and meet me. I've got to come here, and maybe I'll hold your hand and we go there together, right? And so it's really about understanding that I'm in a community that has a very, even with our boys and our men, has a very feminine spirit. And so we've got to make sure that intergenerationally that we are also cultivating this amongst our children, that they see their parents being successful, that they know that they're welcomed in a space. We always provide childcare, and sometimes we don't. We just tell mothers, bring your children. And we understand that the babies are gonna cry, and that we understand that we've gotta be community-based, and that there's an older woman that's happened. You know, an older woman, one of my kids is getting ready to fall out, and that older woman will pick my child up and put that child in her lap and whisper, and she's the baby whisperer. She's already raised 5 kids, you know? And so we have to nurture those
Can you say
type
something
of
about
things.
intergenerational before you leave, because you're getting ready to leave? Intergenerational, in this country, generations are pitted against each other.
Mhm.
It's either youth-led or adult-led.
Right.
In our communities, it is we-led. Every generation has something, the assumption is that I have something to learn from you and I have something to share. And so we work across generations because every generation has a responsibility and we have a relationship to each other, and the table is not set unless everybody's at the table. So I just wanted to say that because people don't really know what intergenerational is, and it's something that comes from our traditions as people of color, and it's something that the Anglo-American construct doesn't understand. So when you're older and you're a woman, you get pushed out. You're young and you're only hot for a second. And really, we should be able to work with each other in a way that works across generations. I just want to say that because sometimes people like intergenerational.